Hi everyone. I am going to go over a paper today for a journal club, and this paper is by Holly White and Priti Shah. In 2006, they published a paper called Uninhibited Imaginations, Creativity in Adults with Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. I wanted to go into this paper because it introduces a nice rigorous, well, relatively speaking, rigorous for the time analysis or understanding of creativity. And yeah, you'll see what I mean. And of course, it uses mediation analysis, which we went over last time. The introduction, it's there's a nice literature review here, and the gist of it is that there have been plenty of attempts at understanding ADHD and creativity, but some of these results have been inconsistent. And the authors set out to establish a more rigorous framework for understanding creativity and ADHD from, as they say, a theoretical perspective, which again is just it's mediation analysis. So let's get into it. For evaluating creativity, they use a couple different tasks or tests, and these are related to convergent thinking and divergent thinking. For convergent thinking, they use the remote associates test, remote associates test, or RAT. I don't know if people just say RAT, but RAT. And the idea is that each participant is given a set of three words, and they're supposed to say a fourth word that relates to all three. So mines, lick, sprinkle. You say salt, claw, teeth, stripes, and you're supposed to say tiger. Mouse, computer, or sorry, mouse, keyboard, monitor, and you're supposed to say computer, stuff like that. So there's a way to measure how well someone is able to think convergently. And then for the opposite direction, for divergent thinking, there's a popular measure called the unusual uses test. And participants are required to generate as many uses as possible for a common object, such as brick. You might want to build a house, pave a driveway, throw it through a window. And the number, originality, and flexibility of responses are taken as indices of divergent thinking. We'll explain both a tiny bit more in a little bit. So you can imagine, as a hypothesis, in fact, the authors do hypothesize that people with ADHD are better at divergent thinking and relatively worse at convergent thinking. For the method, I wanted to highlight how they chose the participants here because they take an incredible amount of care. Now, they took 90 undergraduates from some introductory psychology course, and they made sure that people in the ADHD group were diagnosed both with some form of ADHD by a clinician, and they used some kind of self-report assessment. And then once they went through that part, they describe how there was an additional self-report diagnostic instrument, and the Boatwright-Bracken Adult Attention Deficit Disorder Scale. And they were also careful to make sure that people with ADHD didn't have medication, were either had never taken medication or had taken medication or had not taken medication for at least 1 year. They also made sure that people were similar in age. They controlled for gender. They controlled for academic achievement according to the ACT scores and GPAs. So you can see the standard deviations reasonably close. Kind of sad that the ADHD group has a lower GPA relative to the control. Oh well. Yeah, in fact, all the standardized test scores are consistently lower, although very high variance. Interesting. Anyways, self-report forms, they show all the data here, which is a really important thing when you have a study like this with potentially many confounds. You want to be as transparent as possible with all these sources of data. And in fact, with virtually all the reputable papers we've seen, they do exactly this, where they show all the data. They're very clear about their methodology for picking just the participants. Okay. And remote associates test, we just discussed that with the example of the mine's lick sprinkle. You're given the three words, and they're thrown a bunch of words, a bunch of sets of words. The participants are thrown a bunch of sets of words, and they're asked to create the fourth word to associated with these three for 5 minutes. Okay, and then the proportion of correct responses. It's pretty easy to determine what's correct and not. There's a way to quantify that, and then that's used as an index of convergent thinking. And for the unusual uses task, they're given 2 minutes, and there are three sub scores within the unusual uses task. There's fluency, which is the number of non-redundant uses per object. Flexibility, the number of categories generated, and the number of category shifts between responses. So I don't know what the shifts here are, but we can imagine that if the uses are very broad, then you'd have a high flexibility score. Broad as in, they're not used in similar ways in similar contexts. And then originality. Uniqueness of response, I like this one. Uniqueness of response as measured by the statistical frequency of each response in the entire sample. So they compare the originality of the responses relative to the people that are taking the test. So I think these are really nice baseline measures of creativity. It kind of satisfies that subjective measure of creativity where you come up with something novel and really nails a more objective definition of creativity. Okay, so there's scores for each of these that the researchers can measure. And then here is what will later be our mediator. And this is the semantic inhibition of return task. And it's a little bizarre to me how this works, but I think I do understand it. So what the participants are shown, right? This is the third task that each participant has to do. The first two being the remote associates test, and the second the unusual uses task. So the third test, the participants see a word in the middle of their screen, and then it's replaced by a new word. So the first word is something like, as they describe here, it could be tiger. Okay, so that has one, what they call a semantic category. So that's, the domain of animals, carnivores, predators. And then they're shown a second word, which is completely different in terms of the semantic category. So the second word could be pen. So there, it has nothing to do with predators or animals. It's a completely different object. So the third word they're shown is either a real word or a nonsense word. And the participant is asked to say whether or not it's a real word. So I think what they're testing here is the ability of, and they have to do that as quickly as possible without error. So I think what they're doing is testing the ability of the participant to not go back to the second word that was shown, and keep in mind, right, yeah, because the third word is either in the same semantic category as the first, or it's not. So there's some underlying measure of inhibition that I'm not quite capturing here in my description, but yeah, I think the idea is if it's a similar semantic category as the first, then maybe it's a little easier. And then if it's a different semantic category as the first, it's going to be a little harder. And yeah, I don't know. inhibition. The third test or task is semantic inhibition of return. And the idea is that the participant has to inhibit the previously activated semantic categories. So I hadn't seen this phrase before, and the idea, so I'll explain it as I explain the experimental procedure here. So first, the participant is shown a word, for example, tiger. So that has its own semantic category, meaning that it's an animal, it's a predator, it has claws. There's some category in which it belongs to, in some sense. And then the participant is shown a second word, in this case, for example, pen. And the semantic category here is very different from tiger. Pen is a completely different object that appears in completely different contexts. And then finally, the subject is shown a third word, which is either real, for example, lion, or a nonsense word, for example, loney. And the third word is either congruent or incongruent with the semantic category represented by the Q word. So the congruence and incongruence, I'm not sure how this fits in with the idea of inhibition, but I believe the idea overall is that you're supposed to see this word and then try and ignore the second word that was shown, in this case pen, and recall whether or not loney is related to tiger. So I believe that's how it tests inhibition. Okay, and then there's a way to quantify the results of that. Okay. Now, the results here I think are pretty cool. So semantic IOR, which tests in some way it tests the ability of the participant to inhibit responses. The control group had 1 score, and we can see that the ADHD group had a lowest score. And the authors do say, they explain quite a bit that this is a statistically significant difference. The remote associates task that tests convergent thinking, again, the control group performs better than the ADHD group. And the unusual uses task in all categories, fluency, flexibility, originality, the ADHD group performed better in a statistically significant way. So that's a pretty cool table. But what I really want to go into is the part of the mediation. So the authors hypothesized that semantic IOR, this task related to inhibition, is a mediator between ADHD and the remote associates task, as well as the UUT, but we'll focus on the remote associates task. And here's what's happening. So let me pull up my tablet. There we go. We have ADHD as our independent variable. We have the inhibition of return, which is our proposed mediator. And we have the remote associates task. Which is our dependent variable. And the authors go through exactly the procedure that we discussed last time. So let me get my video ready. So first, as expected, ADHD explained a significant proportion of variance in semantic IOR and reliably predicted semantic IOR scores. Okay. So that's this line. So from X to M, we have a statistically significant relationship there. Oops. Next, ADHD explained a significant proportion of variance in RAT performance and reliably predicted RT scores. So the remote associates task, we get ADHD explain X to Y in a significantly in a statistically significant way. Next, when ADHD status and semantic IOR were entered together as predictors, the resulting model explained a significant proportion of variance in RAT scores, and semantic IOR reliably predicted the RAT scores. This is worded a little weird, but I believe this is the relationship between the mediator and the dependent variable. So they establish this relationship clearly. And finally, when semantic IOR was also included as a predictor, ADHD no longer predicted RAT scores. So they did MX multilinear regression here, and they found that X no longer had a predictive power in predicting the scores of the remote associate task. So there we go. All this together shows that M is in fact a mediator. M being the inhibition of return task. So there we go. This shows that. So finally, they included both the inhibition of return and ADHD as predictors to try and predict the results of the remote associates task. And they found that the effect from X to Y completely disappeared. So we do in fact have IOR as a mediator. So that's pretty cool. The authors are then very careful to conclude the results of this finding. So right. Okay, so the conclusion from this part is that the effect of ADHD status on RAT performance, of course, it's mediated by semantic IOR, as the results show, and they say it's consistent. So notice the very careful wording. It's consistent. This result is consistent with the hypothesis. It doesn't prove anything. It's consistent with the hypothesis that ADHD-related deficits in inhibitory control underlie the relatively poor convergent thinking observed for the ADHD group. Okay, so the results are consistent with the hypothesis, and they're saying we're being cautiously optimistic, and we're saying that there may be ADHD-related deficits in inhibitory control that cause these differences in scores. Okay, so they're not overstating their results, they're not overgeneralizing here, and this is a hallmark of a very good study and well-trained researchers to not overstate their results, and to be very, very precise in what they're saying. And interestingly, it turns out that IOR was not a mediator between ADHD and performance on the UUT. And interestingly, it's shown that IOR, the inhibition of return, is not a mediator of the unusual uses task. But this is still okay, so not the end of the world. Evidence suggests that individuals with ADHD may have multiple inhibitory control deficits, and it's possible that semantic IOR, inhibition of return, may primarily tap inhibition of some specific subset of cognition That's that doesn't show up with the unusual uses task. So yeah, we don't quite know in this case. And again, another hallmark of a good paper, they're able to, and this is an example of yeah. Okay, and in their discussion, I really appreciate this. Again, another hallmark of a good paper, care must be taken in generalizing these findings, of course, and this is always true of any study. Care must be taken because these findings were done in under very specific circumstances with a very, very highly controlled group, which, by the way, I trust these results a lot because of how much care they took into to picking their subjects. And it's pretty much at a point as you would expect, but still it's really great that it feels reproducible in the sense that I could see myself designing a similar study and going through the same steps. Of course, these results don't include individuals with low intelligence or learning disabilities. The current sample includes relatively high achieving college students, so it's possible that people with ADHD who are more creative happen to also enroll in college. So that's something that one should keep in mind when it comes to understanding these results. It's also possible that these results might not be true for people with ADHD, of different subtypes of ADHD. And we also don't know the impact of medication on people with ADHD. So certainly at the time, I'd have to look at the literature to see if it's still true. But people prior to this 2006 study did take a look at that, and the results were inconclusive. I mean, yeah, this one study found that stimulant medication affected some parts of creative ability, and other studies didn't find an effect of medication on creativity. Now, ADHD subtypes may differ in terms of the present findings aren't necessarily true for different subtypes of ADHD. We just don't know if there is a difference or if there's not a difference. And the impact of medication on creativity and the impact of medication on creativity is not known. It was certainly not known at the time. I'd have to look at the literature to see if it's still not known. But they cite a few references here showing different results. And of course, that could be a result of how they define creativity. In this paper, it's very clearly defined. So I'd have to look at those papers to see what that's about. And there's a positive message to all of this. This, of course, the divergent thinking style may... There's a positive message to all of this. Of course, the divergent thinking style could help thinking outside the box. And in fact, I hear that a lot from YouTube videos of people that talk about ADHD. It's possible that this type of thinking can help people adapt old concepts to new situations, which is another form of creativity. And this understanding, gaining a better understanding of ADHD and creativity could really help people with brains that work differently, because then we can help them find problems or careers that help them utilize their brain to its fullest extent, right? And I think that's it's a very nice thought that they included in this discussion, and that's something I really strongly agree with. They probably did that because it sounds like almost like a justification or something that would go into a grant. So there you go. It seems like the inhibition of return task, so some form of inhibition control, mediates someone having ADHD and their ability to exhibit convergent thinking. And intuitively, this certainly makes sense. But here, there's a paper that really establishes it with some pretty solid data. All right, I'll leave it at that. Thank you for watching.